It is a genuine joy to be with you this morning and the audience we have here live and wherever you are, regionally or nationally or internationally. We've been through a lot in the last year and a half, 2 years, but everybody has. And one of the questions that comes up is, what about saints assembling? And so this morning I'd like to share a lesson with you on the value of Christian assembly. Some of the questions that sometimes people ask and wonder, what about this or what about that? One is, should we just meet regardless of the health? And whatever happens, happens, and we'll just come and we don't much care. Say, ooh, boy, that's pretty exciting. What if we just meet as a family? We just don't come at all, because doesn't Matthew 18 down in verse 20 say where 2 or 3 are gathered, there am I in their midst? So maybe we don't have to do this at all. As a matter of fact, isn't online virtual worship practically the same as in person? So maybe it doesn't matter at all. We just kind of stay at home, watch TV, and it'll all be fine. Just a little humorous, as Glenn and I were getting ready this morning, I said, Glenda, let's just stay home and watch it on television. I said, wait a minute, we're part of this. We need to be here, just having fun along that line. Well, what about some of these principles that we wrestle with? What about risks, and what about trusting God? Well, the reality is we ought to trust God. But that's true in times of pandemic, in times of prosperity, and all the time. So should we meet regardless of health risks and just trust God? Well, I thought about that a little bit. And then some of the principles that pop up are, life is absolutely unpredictable. Trusting God is always essential, not just in these times. In Ecclesiastes chapter 7 and down in verse 14, in times of prosperity be happy. In times of adversity consider that God has made one as well as the other, that man should not discover anything that will be after him. I don't care if it's the stock market, I don't care if it's politics, I don't care if it's your health. You never know. You just turn a corner and surprise, what does that mean? In all of our lives, we need to trust God. Your situation or the situation of people you love is beyond your understanding, but it's not beyond God's understanding. God knows what's going on. He knows the hows, he knows the whys, and he knows the whens. When do you not know what to do or what not to do or what will happen next? All of those things are in the hand of God. So since life is unpredictable and we do trust God, and Proverbs chapter 3 verse 5 and 6, it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. You know, the stock market says, and home values is this, and Fauci and COVID says that, but the politicians say this other thing, and my neighbor's dog, there's always stuff. But the reality is, what keeps us out of a lot of controversy, we just go to the Bible and say, what does the Bible have to say? You know, my opinion is, and I think because of the rotation of the earth and the proximity of Andromeda galaxy, what's the Bible have to say? And that's what really is our true compass heading. And one of the things God says is use wisdom. A passage that I like, you might like to highlight in your Bibles, is Proverbs chapter 9 and verse 12. If you are wise for yourself. That is, you're the one that gets blessed. He said, if you're a fool, well, then you suffer. Oh, it doesn't matter to me. And I thought about the application of that in different areas of life. Do you trust God? Yes. Well, if you trust God, what about your house? Do you have a lock on the door? Well, yeah. And a deadbolt. Yeah, but just trust God. It doesn't matter. What about a lock on your car? Well, I just trust God. No, all of us have locks on our houses, have locks on our cars. Well, do you have car insurance, or you just trust God? I do trust God to bring me through. But God asked us to use wisdom and operate in a reasonable manner. How about a seatbelt? Do you wear a seatbelt? Yes. When you're in the garage and start the engine, do you put it on instantly? No. Glenda does. We don't move 2 feet, but within a quarter mile, mine is on. Do you always? Yes. Well, how about if we just trust God, do you even read the labels on your medicine? No, I just take whatever pills around. None of us do that. We look at, use wisdom, what is the right way to handle this or that medicine? I just trust God. You see a doctor? Well, generally we do when this or that happens, and sometimes people don't and pay a price. It's not fun to see a dentist. It's not a lot of fun to see a doctor. But God says, if you're wise, you are wise for yourself. So do use wisdom in these areas and trust God as we do. We follow God's commands, knowing that as you practice obedience, He's working out the rest. So try to use good judgment, do what God wants, and trust Him for the results. Well, what about this other question? Regardless of the health risks, well, think about this. God had safety precautions, even in the Old Testament, for skin disease. When you didn't have all these, CAT scans and lab tests and such as this. And so in Leviticus chapter 13 and verse 3, when a person thought they had leprosy or some form of skin condition, they don't know if it's contagious, they don't know if it's fatal, they don't know if it's just passing. You had a test. You went to see the priest. And the priest looked at it and says, okay, that's nothing, don't worry about it. Or he said, that looks suspicious. It's deeper than just a surface area. And so interesting, I thought about, for COVID, we have a test. It's not 100% test. It's kind of yes or kind of no. But, that's better probably than a coin toss. In the Old Testament, when they thought you had a disease, like some form of leprosy, whatever that was, and it said, it's not just a surface thing, it's beneath the lower level of the skin, they were quarantined for 7 days. And then you saw the priest again. And then if that healed up, or it actually looks a little worse, you're quarantined for a full 14 days. Interestingly, we have some of those national guidelines for people today in dealing with COVID. And then one that we have thought about and made jokes about in Leviticus 13 down in verse 45. If you did have leprosy or some of this not easily curable skin disease, the person was directed to cover his mouth, the upper lip, the mustache, and cry, unclean. And so Glenn and I have kind of joked about it for years. One of us gets the flu or something, and we walk around out, unclean, unclean. Well, what does that do? Well, when that happens, that cry of unclean generally initiated some physical distancing. Somebody, hey man, I'm contagious. You want a hug? No, not so much. And so we use some of those same biblical principles as we deal with certain conditions today. Well, yeah, but the person says, but what about me? Well, people have all different levels of vulnerability. Little kids can get COVID. Old people tend to be more vulnerable. People with pre-existing health conditions are. And so what do? Well, God asks us to use wisdom, make some wise choices, and what's right for your case. Paul, do you know what's right for every individual? Of course not. That you'll have a sense of here's what's good for me and my family. And various states have their own mandates. And so you use wisdom in your case, and you use wisdom in your state. Some states have almost no guidelines. Some have huge pandemic things, some don't. That's beyond my understanding. I just leave all that in God's hands. What God shows is, don't be nutty about it. Use wisdom. Well, what about this? Can't we, maybe we avoid all that health issue. We just stay home, we worship with our family, and never come back because of Matthew 18 and in verse 20. What I'm going to share with you this morning, I'd like you to look at your Bibles on this, and the context deals with church discipline. When Jesus says in Matthew 18, whether 2 or 3 are gathered together, there am I in their midst. Now, let me also say that's controversial. People have all kinds of opinions. Yeah, but I think this and I think that. And from my standpoint, that's okay. You got to figure it out. I want to share with you. I can prove what the context says. If you say, yeah, but I have a different understanding on that one verse. You work that out. I'm just showing what the context says. Although people argue about even that. In Matthew chapter 18, and beginning in verse 15, and we're going to go down through verse 21 or so, that he starts in an area of, what if your brother sins against you? Paul Mitchell is a dirty dog, and he stole my pickup truck, and he said, I was just barring it overnight, although I didn't actually ask your permission. I hot-wired it, and I got it, and I'm going to Atlanta, Georgia. You going to Atlanta? Are you going to the East Coast somewhere? New Jersey. My goodness. Everybody's leaving New Jersey. Why would you? Oh, you're going to see Gordy Hodgson. That's what you're going to do. And so anyhow, listen. Okay, he stole my pickup. He's driving it across the country, and he's going to sell it in New Jersey. And he comes back and says, man, I had a great trip. I said, hold it. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his sin in private. So, Paul, that was a bad deal for me. He said, oh man, I had a great trip. Thank you. I said, but I didn't want you to sell my pickup. That's my only pickup. And oh no, don't worry about it. God will give you another one. And so I bring Mike Walker, Richard Berry with me. Would you go help me? I want you to talk. Mitchell done me wrong. And they go with me. And so you confront a sinning brother and see if he responds, because you're taking a witness or two with you. That at the mouth of two, if it's me and Mike, or me, Mike, and Richard, seeing Paul, he said, okay, no, Paul Mitchell said, I spent the money, it's gone, don't worry about it. Oh my goodness. And then he says, you tell it to the church, and if he refused to hear the church, let him be to you as a tax collector or just a total rebellious sinner. I don't have anything to do with them. Now, so far, everybody recognizes that has to do with church discipline. Now, what's interesting is when you get down to verse 18. Because as you look at Matthew chapter 18, and in this section on church discipline, the very next verse he says, truly I say to you, whatever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Well, does that mean every congregation says, hey, we've just made up some new church laws, and here's the gospel, and it's going to contain this, or we're taking out that? In Matthew chapter 16 and in verse 19, 2 chapters previous, Jesus says to Peter that here's what you've done. You've made a confession of faith, and upon this rock I will build my church, and I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound, or some versions like the New American Standard Updated Version says, shall have been bound in heaven. Peter, you're not making up new laws. You're going to preach on earth what God has determined. In this passage, in church discipline, what he's saying now to all the apostles is, I want to tell you, when you're telling the people what to do, you are giving God's law. Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound. New International said, shall be bound. That is, you are telling people what God wants. Otherwise, you're saying, everybody make up your own laws. All right, and I believe this and I believe that. And God says, okay, we'll just accommodate everybody. And then look in verse 19. After he says that, he said, and again I say to you, if two of you, notice this, if two of you, whoever the you are, agree on earth about anything that they may say. Notice there's two different groups. If two of you agree to whatever they may say. Anything they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. Isn't that interesting? And people have different opinions of who is the you and who is the they. Jesus was talking to the disciples. We know he's been talking to Peter, because Peter speaks up here in the next verse or two. What he's asking is, if two of you apostles agree, that is, you're not making up new laws. You're developing, yes, this is in accordance with God's will. And the church or other individuals ask it, it'll be done for them. Now think about that. Because having said that, now verse 20, where he comes down and it's his conclusion, for where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, there am I in their midst. Now people take this as, well, that means what I'm going to do is, I like hunting and fishing. Actually, I'm going to skip church for the next month, but I'm taking some unleavened bread out there with me. And me and Matt Mitchell are going hunting. We're going salmon fishing, and we'll see you back in about a month. But we've got a little bit of fruit of the vine, and because where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, well, we're actually gathered in the name of fishing salmon or whatever. And what he's saying is, I mean, isn't God always with you? But what he's saying is, if 2 or 3 are gathered by my authority, he said, I'm there. That's what the Apostle Paul said to the saints in Corinth when they were needed to discipline an unruly brother. He said, and I, being with you in spirit, I'm not there personally, but I understand what's going on, and what that brother's doing is absolutely wrong. And then notice, in that same vein, look with me in verse 21. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? And Jesus said, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. And so here's the area where he's talking about how to deal with people that are out of line. And you say, okay, I write you 2 times and I'm writing you off. He said, no, as long as they're willing to. Years or in 30 years, 490 times. Why? Because we're always doing something nutty. And so as you're looking at this, that is, Christ is with us. But this particular context of Matthew 18 and verse 20 is dealing with church discipline and apostolic law. So if you're going to use as you'd use to stay home and just hang out on the sofa, because it's dealing with church discipline, not the minimum required for assembly. If you say, Paul, I don't believe that. I think it's just the opposite. Look, I'm not the church state patrol. I just want you to consider that. It's clear that this is in the context of discipline. And so he is with us, and I think about passages like Matthew 28 and verse 18. He said, Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. And so he's with us, but this isn't the passage that I'd use to justify just meeting with your family. Well, how about this last question? Isn't online or virtual worship practically the same as in person? No. So it sounds like it, but has anybody, I've had the opportunity to try that virtual reality headset on. Anybody else tried one of those on? Oh, okay, just a couple. They're really cool. Anthony Pena family had one, and so I put it on, and this particular scenario was under the sea. I mean, you're watching, it almost feels like you'd reach out and touch it. Here's a whale swimming by, wow, and here's a reef and all these colored tropical fish, absolutely beautiful. Take it off, what's there? Nothing. It was just, it may have sound with it, it'll have sight with it, but it's really not real. Virtual means almost or nearly as described, but not completely or according to the strict definition. It's not really meeting, but it's kind of like it. Virtual reality is an artificial environment created by a computer software that appears to be a real environment, but it isn't real. It's cool, but it's not real. Think about this. As we broadcast, and I'm so thankful we can because there are people that cannot come. There were times when, meetings were shut down. Zoom broadcasting helps if there is an emergency. And, we had arson, we had COVID-19. And when people are sick or recovering from hip surgery or this or that or homebound for some other reason, it's a great asset because they can't be here. But it's not actually assembly. It's just like it. So if it's not really assembly, then why assemble? And I just have here 3 reasons I'd like you to think about. Number 1, why to assemble is that it's clear. God commands it. Down in Hebrews chapter 10 and in verse 25. Here's the Hebrew writer says, do not forsake the assembling of ourselves together as the habit of some. He said, some have already just, we quit. Now, in their case, it seemed to have been persecution. Man, if people catch us going to church, we're going to be in trouble with the government and people this. And so they were starting to say, I can be a Christian just at home. God knows my heart. I'm a friend of God. Wait a minute. God says, even in times of persecution, you meet together. We have that example of the Apostle Paul, right? In Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, they came to Troas. They waited 7 days. And on the first day of the week, they gathered together to break bread, and Paul spoke to them. It was important enough to do. He said, do not forsake the assembling of ourselves together. That word, forsake, is to desert, just totally abandon. And it doesn't mean, you're sick one week and just can't or something like that. The New International Version says it a little differently. It says, let us not give up meeting together. The New Century Version said, let us not stay away from church meetings as the habit of some is. And so some just became, that's what we're just not going to come anymore. I'm a Christian in my heart, and God knows my heart, and that's good enough. But Psalm 122 and in verse 1, the psalmist said, I was glad when they said, let us go up to the house of the Lord. Man, it is good to come together for ourselves, and I've heard other people say, if you miss a Sunday, it's kind of like the week is just off balance. It's just not, wow. Our battery isn't recharged. It's just not the same. And virtual worship helps in times of emergency, but it's not really assembly. Luke 6 and verse 46, Jesus said, why do you call me Lord? Oh, you're the ruler. Yes, sir, you're the ruler, and do not do what I say. So if he is, he gets to rule in our hearts. Sunday worship should be the reason for missing everything else. Do you know the Seahawks are playing? They're playing right now. Oh, maybe we should just all stay home. We'll record the worship service, and after the football game, we'll pick up. Wait a minute. You can record the football game, and you get to that later. We get to rejoice in being together with one another. Another reason for assembling together is because it is inconvenient. It is a sacrifice. That's what sacrifice is. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1, he says, present your bodies a living, you're not taking this goat, draining out the blood, so okay, here's my sacrifice. A living, vibrant, and holy, a set-apart sacrifice. Acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Yeah, but it's inconvenient. That's what It is. Think about this. Is parenting inconvenient? Well, yeah, you got kids, they got all our problems and dentists and sports and acne and car accidents. It's just life, but it's so worth it. And so think about worshiping together does require sacrifice, but it is so worth it. Back in the Old Testament, King Jeroboam wanted to set up a new system of religion because they had just divided the nation. And so this guy, it's self-interest. And he says, oh man, if the people have to keep coming from northern Israel down to Jerusalem to worship, after a while they're going to say, it's just, we might as well just kind of get in with them again and we'll all be one. But he didn't want them to be reunited because it meant loss of power. And so he instituted calf worship. My comment is the calf worship was one of convenience. At least that's how it was promoted, not conviction. He said in 1 Kings 12, verse 28 and 29, it is too much for you to go to Jerusalem. Oh man, you got to get up in the morning, you actually got to wash and comb your hair, and you got to get dressed, and then you got to drive, and now we can just all stay home where it's convenient. He said, no, it's a sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice worth giving. Think about this. David numbered Israel, and not that God wanted him to do that, and he was encouraged not to do that, and he did it anyhow. And it initiated a plague, and he was told by the prophet Gad what he needed to do is offer a sacrifice, and there was a faithful Jew, Araunah, who was a landowner, and he had the threshing floor, he had the oxen, he had the yoke of oxen. And David said, I will buy them from you. And Araunah said, no, my Lord, you're king. Here, build your altar right here. You can have the oxen, slay them, use them for sacrifice. Here's the equipment. Here's the yokes and all such as in a plow. You can use all that wood to burn up the sacrifice. And David said, no, I will not offer to God that which costs me nothing. What if it was on your 25th or 35th or 45th wedding anniversary and your wife said, honey, let's go out for a lovely candlelight romantic dinner. And then afterward, we could just get this neat, go out to a really sweet romantic movie that I've come across. And what if the husband said, well, Gladys, I don't feel like getting off the couch. Let's just live stream a movie, and we got some leftover pizza in the fridge. Wives, how would that go over? Not so good. And husbands, if you think that would work, you might consider marriage counseling, because that's not a sacrifice. That's what we always do. But if we love God, we're going to prioritize this day, because the first command is love God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Sure, it's inconvenient. Sure, it's a sacrifice. It's meant to be. But there's some blessings, and here's my third and final point. Why assemble together? Because you can't serve others when you're laying on the couch. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24, it said, consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds. You can't do that if you're not here. Because you're here, you help us. You're looking at one another and helping them grow, and hey, you're showing affection and concern. I had a brother in state further east said, man, I'm going to this congregation. After the sermon is over, prayer is over, he said, 30 seconds, boom, everybody's out of the building. Whoa, doesn't sound like they like each other very much. Here, we want to talk, how you doing, and love you, man, I'll just, and that going. And so you get the opportunity to encourage people to grow, to take that next step. Hebrews 10:25, that don't forsake the assembling of yourselves together, but encourage one another. And more as you see the day approaching. Maybe they were looking toward, boy, here's all the social problems they had, and maybe it was the destruction of Jerusalem. Man, we're in crazy times. You can encourage people to be faithful. Tell them you love them. I help you. I'm right there with you. If you're here, you can't do that if you're at home. Colossians 3:16, you can't teach and admonish. You can't teach and caution people in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs that you're singing by yourself at home. You do that when you're together, and it's just a joy. In 1 Corinthians 10:17, you can't partake of the Lord's Supper with us. You may be doing it at home. You may be doing it with your husband and wife at home, but you're not doing it with us. Those that are one body partake of the one bread. That's what we do here. You can do that if you're united and here. Proverbs 27:17. You don't get the benefit of the encouragement from others. Not only you give it, but you get it. It's like a battery and an alternator. That you give energy and you get energy. That like iron sharpens iron. So one man sharpens another. You get that when you're together. Please come. So staying at home and watching online is helpful in an emergency, but it's not the same as being here. So I want you to think about this, the value of Christian assembly. We have one of our songs. It says, it's the servant song. It says, Lord, make me a servant, just like your son. For he was a servant. Please make me one. I would be lowly, humble inside, giving to others in all that I do, in love for my brother. Make me like you. That's what we're trying to do, be more like Jesus. If you've not been baptized into Christ and you say, man, I am ready. I'm ready to take that step. I believe in Jesus Christ. I repent of my sins. I want to confess my faith. I want to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of my sins. We've got that opportunity. We're going to rise and sing this song, number 255, I Am Resolved. If you are, won't you come forward and let us know.